The car smelled like lemon-scented cleaner and recycled air. It was the official scent of the Department of Family Services' synthetic, careful design to mask everything real. Nora Vane had been breathing that smell for 2 years. In caseworkers' sedans, in waiting rooms with plastic chairs, in group homes where the windows never opened all the way. She knew it so well she had stopped noticing it the way a highway stops being a sound and becomes a condition when you live too close to one. Today was different. Today she noticed everything. It was her 16th birthday. The state of Pennsylvania called it emancipation. The paperwork used words like transition and independence and self-sufficiency. The caseworker, a woman named Ms. Aldrich, used the word options carefully, the way you'd hand someone a glass that was already cracked. What it meant, stripped of every polite word they dressed it in, was simple. The system was done with her. The door was open. The world was outside. Good luck. Nora sat in the back seat with a black trash bag between her feet. Everything she owned was in it. 3 changes of clothes, a paperback novel with the spine cracked in 2 places, a photograph in a plastic sleeve, a young woman with dark eyes and an easy smile caught mid-laugh at something just outside the frame. Her mother. That was it. That was the whole inventory of Nora Vane's life on the morning of her 16th birthday. Miss Aldrich kept her eyes on the highway, hands precise on the wheel. She was a woman built for procedure. Her kindness was real, but measured the kind that came with documentation attached. "There's a transitional housing program in Allentown," she said. "We've discussed it. There's a bed available. It has structure, curfew, shared kitchen job placement assistance." She paused. "It's a solid setup, Nora." Nora watched the trees go by. Gray November light, bare branches against a white sky. Pennsylvania in late autumn looked like something waiting to be over. "I know," she said. "However," Ms. Aldrich's tone shifted barely just a half step, enough for Nora to turn from the window. "There's been a legal development, something that came through the office last week." Nora waited. In the system, you learned to wait. You waited for decisions about your life to arrive from people who didn't know your middle name. You waited to be moved, assessed, approved, denied, redirected. Waiting was the one skill she had genuinely mastered. "Your maternal grandfather passed away 5 weeks ago," Ms. Aldrich said. "His name was Arthur Calloway. He lived in a town called Mill Haven, about 3 hours from here." The words arrived but didn't attach to anything. Grandfather. The word belonged to other people's lives. To Christmas mornings in houses with fireplaces. Nora's file said she had no living relatives. That was the foundational fact of her existence, the first sentence of her story. She had no family. She had been told this so many times it had become something she carried in her body rather than just her memory. "I don't have a grandfather," she said, flat, certain. "You did," Ms. Aldrich said carefully. "The connection was traced through your mother's records. It took some time to verify, but it's been confirmed. Arthur Calloway was Della Calloway's father. Your mother's father. Della." Her mother's name spoken aloud in a car still felt strange, like hearing music from a house you weren't allowed to enter. "He named you as his sole heir," Ms. Aldrich continued. "His estate includes property, land, and a business." Nora looked at her. "What kind of business?" "A sawmill." She said it simply. "In Mill Haven, 112 acres of timberland and the mill itself. There's also significant debt attached to the property and a purchase offer from a development company that's apparently been pursuing the land for years." She let that settle. "The executor of the estate, a Mr. Edmund Hale, needs to meet with you before any decisions are made. That's where we're going now." Nora turned back to the window. A sawmill. She had never once in her life thought about a sawmill. She pictured something enormous and rusted, a building that smelled of wet wood and machine oil standing in a field somewhere, forgetting it existed. "So the transitional housing," she said slowly, "is still available for 24 hours. Ms. Aldrich's voice was neutral, but the implication was clear. This was a door. One of them led to a bed in Allentown, and a curfew and a shared kitchen. The other led somewhere she couldn't see yet. For the first time all morning, Nora felt something other than dread. It was small and uncertain, and she didn't trust it entirely. But it was there. The rest of the drive passed in a new kind of silence. Not empty, full. Millhaven looked like a town that had been handsome once and had made peace with the fact that it wasn't anymore. Main Street ran 4 blocks of brick storefronts, an old movie house with a marquee that still worked, a hardware store, a diner with a Formica counter visible through the glass. The kind of place where everyone drove the same roads every day and knew which potholes to avoid. A water tower stood at the east end of town with Millhaven painted in faded blue letters. A church steeple rose above the tree line to the west. Miss Aldrich parked in front of a 2-story building on Chestnut Street. A brass plate beside the door read, "Hale and Associates Attorneys at Law." The "and Associates" had been painted over at some point, just slightly darker than the rest. They went up a narrow staircase that creaked with each step. The office at the top was one large room that smelled of old paper and wood polish, and something else, something faintly sweet and ancient, like a book left in the sun. Floor-to-ceiling shelves held leather-bound volumes in shades of burgundy and dark green. A partner's desk, the size of a small boat, dominated the center of the room. The man who stood up behind it was in his late 60s. White hair, a tweed jacket with worn elbows, and a face that had lived through enough to stop pretending things were simpler than they were. He looked at Nora without cataloging her, without the practiced assessment she was used to from people whose job it was to evaluate her. He just looked. "Miss Vane," he said. His voice was deep and unhurried. "I'm Edmund Hale. Please sit down." The meeting lasted 40 minutes. Ms. Aldrich handled the official transfer of folder-form signatures. Edmund took the folder and set it to the side without opening it. When Ms. Aldrich stood to leave, she touched Nora's shoulder once briefly, and then the door clicked shut behind her, and 2 years of Nora's life walked out of the room. Edmund waited. "That's a considerable thing to happen on a birthday," he said after a moment. "I've had worse birthdays," Nora said. He almost smiled. Arthur would have said something like that. He opened the file on his desk, Callaway Arthur written in ink on the tab. He explained the estate methodically. 112 acres of timberland. The mill itself, built by Arthur's own hands beginning in 1984, completed and operational by 1986. A property that had supplied lumber to half the county for 2 decades. And then the debt alone taken out in 2019 against the property equipment ordered and never installed, now in default. Edmund slid a letter across the desk. Bank letterhead. Words like foreclosure and accelerated payment in default in bold. Then a second document on glossy paper. Northridge Development Corporation. A formal purchase offer. The number at the bottom of the page was large enough that Nora read it twice. "They've been trying to acquire this property for almost a decade," Edmund said. "Arthur refused every approach. But with the estate in probate and the debt unresolved, they've renewed their offer formally. They're willing to assume all existing debt. You would receive the remainder placed in trust until you're 18, managed by this office." He sat back and let the 2 options exist in the room without pushing her toward either one. "Why did he refuse to sell?" Nora asked. Edmund was quiet for a moment. "He said the land wasn't for them, that they didn't understand what it was." He paused. "He built that mill with nothing but his hands and borrowed time. For him, it wasn't a business. It was the proof that he existed." He reached into the lower drawer of his desk and set a small cardboard box on the surface between them. It was unremarkable. Ordinary cardboard, a length of jute twine tied around it. Her name was written on top in strong, slanted handwriting. "Nora. He left this for you specifically," Edmund said. "The will states that you were to receive it before making any decision about the property." Nora looked at the box. It was not large, not heavy by the look of it, but it had a gravity that had nothing to do with weight. "I need to see it," she said. "The mill, before I decide anything." Edmund looked at her for a long moment. Then he picked up the phone on his desk. "Beckett," he said into it. "It's Edmund Hale. I've got a passenger for you, out to the Callaway place." Yes. Now. Thank you. He hung up. Beckett Dern will take you. He knows that land better than anyone still living. He was one of Arthur's earliest workers. Edmund held out a heavy iron key, old-fashioned, the kind with a round grip and a long shaft. This opens the main door to the mill and the office inside. It was Arthur's. It's yours now. The key was cold and solid. It felt like holding something that had already outlasted several versions of the world. 5 minutes later, a pickup truck the color of old denim pulled to the curb. The man behind the wheel was somewhere north of 60, lean and weathered, with the kind of steady hands that came from a lifetime of physical work. He pushed the passenger door open from the inside. Nora Vane. His voice was unhurried, shaped by years of not needing to rush. Hop in. The cab smelled of coffee and sawdust and something like wintergreen. It was a good smell. Real. The opposite of lemon cleaner. Beckett Dern drove without needing to consult anything. The knowledge sat in his hands rather than his head. They left Millhaven behind quickly, the streets giving way to fields, the fields giving way to tree line, and then they were in the forest, and the road beneath them went from asphalt to packed gravel, and the sky closed in overhead. You knew him? Nora asked. Couldn't live in Millhaven and not know Arthur Calloway, Beckett said. He was part of the landscape, like the water tower or the grain elevator, always there, kept to himself more in recent years, but always there. He was quiet for a moment. He was a hell of a craftsman, built things that lasted. The trees pressed close on both sides. Rain had started fine and steady, the kind that softened everything and made sounds feel closer. He talked about you, Beckett said. He said it simply without drama. Not often, but he did. Nora looked at him. Never by name early on, but it was clear he kept track. Beckett's hands were easy on the wheel. That's all I'll say about it, because the rest isn't mine to tell. The truck rounded a long curve in the gravel road, and then the trees opened up suddenly the way a curtain gets pulled. A clearing appeared wide and deep, and in the center of it stood the mill. It was larger than she had imagined. Much larger. A long, low structure with a high peaked roof, its wooden walls weathered to a deep silver gray. Smaller outbuildings stood to the rear, connected by a covered walkway. A gravel yard spread out in front, where trucks had once backed in to load the ruts of their passage still pressed into the earth. Through a long row of high windows along the near wall, the interior was dark and immense, and the faint outline of something enormous and circular was visible in the shadows. The rain fell on all of it without distinction. Beckett stopped the truck at the end of the drive. He cut the engine. The only sounds were the rain on the roof and the wind moving through the pines at the edge of the clearing. Well, he said quietly, here it is. Nora didn't move for a moment. She looked at the building, at the scale of it, at the silence of it. Something in the proportion of the thing, the height of the roof against the tree line, the way the clearing had been cut to give it room, spoke of intention. Whoever built this had not been modest about what they were making. I'll wait, Beckett said, or I can come back, whatever you need. He pointed to a card clipped to the visor above the dash. Number's there. I'll be okay, Nora said. She wasn't entirely sure that was true. She took the box under one arm and the iron key in her other hand, pushed the door open, and stepped out into the rain. It was cold and immediate. She pulled her jacket close and walked up the muddy path to the main entrance. The main sliding doors were shut and rusted along their track. Beside them was a smaller door, standard size, set into the larger frame. She tried the handle. Locked. She put the iron key into the lock. It resisted, stiff with years of disuse. She leaned into it, both hands on the key, turning it by degrees. Something deep in the mechanism shifted ground and then gave a heavy grating clunk, and the lock turned. She pushed the door open. It swung inward on a long, low groan that echoed into the space beyond. She stepped inside. What struck her first was not the scale she had felt that from the truck window, but the smell. It had layers, oil on iron, resin baked into wood grain over decades. Something mineral underneath, like cold stone in a dry well. A smell that belonged entirely to this place, and nothing else that had been accumulating since 1986 and was now so embedded in every surface that it would outlast whatever happened to the building itself. The ceiling rose 40 feet above the concrete floor, held up by massive timber trusses, fitted joints, and precise angles, work done by someone who understood that structure and beauty were not separate things. The rain on the metal roof created a continuous sound, neither gentle nor harsh, just present, a rhythm you could think inside of. Light came through the high windows in long angled shafts. Dust and sawdust moved through them like slow weather. At the center of the floor stood the saw. It was a monument, a circular blade nearly 10 feet in diameter mounted in a heavy iron carriage on a track that ran the length of the main floor. Even dormant, it had authority. The blade's teeth caught the light in sequence as Nora moved. Each one precisely formed part of a hole that had been designed to cut through things that resisted. Around it, the infrastructure of the operation: conveyor belts, roller tables, log decks, spread outward like the rings of a tree. Everything was coated in a thick, even layer of sawdust. Cobwebs draped between machinery and long, patient arcs. The place had not been abandoned in panic or in anger. It had been shut down carefully. Things were in their places, tools were hung, the last log had been processed, and the carriage had been returned to the starting position. Someone had shut this place down and meant to do so properly. Nora walked deeper into the space. Her boots left prints in the sawdust on the concrete floor. She ran her hand along a stack of rough-cut pine boards against the near wall. The wood was dry, cold to the touch, the scent of resin still strong in the grain. Her grandfather had made this specific plank. It existed because of him. She stood with her hand on the wood and thought about that for a long moment. At the far end of the main floor, under a single bare bulb she doubted still worked, was a small glass-walled office, a room within the room. She walked toward it, her footsteps quiet in the sawdust. The office door was unlocked. Inside, a metal desk, a swivel chair, filing cabinets along one wall, a calendar still showing a month from 3 years ago. A coat hook on the back of the door held an old canvas jacket. Everything was dusted in fine gray powder, undisturbed. She set the cardboard box on the desk. The dust puffed up around it and settled. She sat down in the swivel chair. It creaked under her. She looked at the box. There was a moment, just a moment, when she thought about not opening it. When she thought about the number on that glossy letterhead back in Edmund's office. About the transitional housing in Allentown, with its curfew and shared kitchen and structured progression toward a normal, uncomplicated life. About taking the money and leaving this place to the people who wanted it and never looking back. The moment passed. She untied the jute twine, lifted the lid. Inside the box, a small stack of black and white photographs held together with a rubber band, a thin file folder, and a smaller brass key, the kind that fit a diary lock or a small strongbox. She picked up the photographs first. The top one showed a young man, strong jaw, dark eyes, standing in front of a half-built structure she recognized immediately as this building, this mill 30 or 40 years ago. He was not smiling exactly, but there was something in his expression beyond pride. There was certainty. This is the thing I am building, and I am going to finish it. Arthur Calloway at 40. The next photograph, Arthur and a young woman, her arm through his. She was laughing. She was the same woman in the plastic sleeve inside Nora's trash bag. Just younger, lighter. The way her mother looked before whatever had happened. Nora set the photographs down carefully. She picked up the brass key, looked around the office, tried the desk drawer. The key slid in cleanly. The lock turned. Inside the drawer, one object, a gray metal strongbox, heavy, flat-latched. She lifted it onto the desk. The latch was not locked, just closed. She opened it. Inside, bundles of letters tied with faded ribbons stacked in 2 rows. And on top of the first bundle, a sealed envelope with her name written on it in the same hand as the box. Nora. She broke the seal, unfolded the pages inside. They were covered front to back in that strong, slanted handwriting, slightly uneven as if written in stages over time. She began to read. My dearest Nora, if you are reading this, I am gone. And I owe you an explanation. I should have found the courage to deliver in person years ago. I did not, and I am sorry for that. I am sorry for many things. But I want to be clear about what I am not sorry for and why I made the choices I made, because I need you to understand them before you decide anything about this place. You were told you had no family. I know this because I am the one who made it necessary for that to be the story. Not because it was true. It was never true. Your mother, Della, was the best thing I ever had a hand in making. She was sharper than I was and braver than I knew how to be. And when she came back to Mill Haven in 2009, after years away, she had that same fire she always had, but she had found something, something that frightened her. She called me 3 times in the week before she died. The last call, she said she had documents, financial records, names. She said the people behind Northridge Development were not who they appeared to be. And she was right, and they knew she had started to put it together. 3 days after that call, her car left Route 209 on a dry, clear night and went into the ravine below Hatchet Creek. The official report said she lost control. I have never believed that. After Della was gone, they came to me. I want you to understand who I mean when I say they. I mean the kind of men who wear good suits and speak in careful sentences and never say anything directly that can be used against them. They came to my house and sat in my kitchen, and they talked about the property, about what a shame it would be if the mill went under, about how complicated things could become for a man with outstanding debts and a grandchild suddenly in the picture. They looked at you like a lever, so I did the only thing I could think of. I took away the lever. I gave you to the state Nora. I stood in an office and I told a woman in a gray suit that I was not able to care for you, and I signed the papers, and I walked out of that building, and I drove home, and I did not sleep for 3 days. It was the most deliberate thing I have ever done, and the one I will answer for longest. But you were invisible to them after that. An orphan in the system is nobody's leverage. And invisible, I believe, was safe. I watched you from a distance. Edmund helped me. School photographs, case notes, addresses. I knew every place you lived. I knew when things were hard, and I knew when they were less hard. I could not be there, but I was watching, and I am sorry that watching was the only thing I could offer. I left you this mill because it is the only real thing I have. It is also a choice, a genuine one. The world will tell you to take the money, and I will not tell you the world is wrong. There is nothing shameful about choosing a safe and quiet life. You have earned the right to one. But if you have any of my stubborn blood in you, or any of your mother's fire, you might want to know what Della found. You might want to finish what she started. The choice is yours. It is the only thing I could think to give you that was truly yours. I loved you every day. I never stopped. Arthur Nora lowered the letter. The rain on the roof was the only sound. The air in the office was cold and smelled of sawdust and old metal, and the faint ghost of some long-ago pipe smoke. Outside the glass wall of the office, the vast interior of the mill sat in its patient silence, the great blade gleaming faintly in the last of the afternoon light. She did not cry immediately. The grief came in slowly, the way cold comes in through an old window, not all at once, but everywhere through every small opening until the whole room is different. When it came hard. She put her head down on the desk and cried in a way she had not cried since she was small enough that crying still felt like it helped. She cried for the little girl who had been told she was no one's. She cried for the grandfather who had chosen to look like a monster to keep her safe. She cried for her mother who had found something dangerous and told no one but him and paid for it with everything. And then, gradually, the crying stopped. It didn't resolve into anything comfortable, but it stopped. Nora sat up, wiped her face with her sleeve, looked at the letter again. You might want to finish what she started. She picked up the brass key from the desk and the letter and walked out of the glass-walled office into the main floor of the mill. She walked slowly toward the great saw at the center of the room. Standing beside it, looking up at the blade, she could feel the scale of what her grandfather had built. Not just the machine, the whole enterprise. The idea that you could come from nothing in a rural Pennsylvania town and build a thing this large and this permanent with your own hands. She put her palm flat against the cold steel of the blade. She stood there a long time. When she turned around, she walked back to the office, picked up her phone, and dialed the number Beckett Dern had clipped to his visor. He picked up on the second ring. "Still out there?" he asked. "I'm still here," she said. "I need you to do something for me." "Tell me." "Call Mr. Hale. Tell him I'm not selling. And tell him I need to talk to him tonight. Not tomorrow. Tonight." There was a brief silence on Beckett's end. Then, "All right, Nora Vane. I'll tell him." She hung up and looked around the interior of the mill, the trusses, the blade, the stacked lumber, the dust that held the shape of decades of work. Outside, the rain continued to fall on the clearing and the tree line, and the 112 acres of timberland that she now understood had been waiting for her the way that something waits when it has no choice but patience. She did not feel powerful. She did not feel certain. She felt like a 16-year-old girl standing in a very large building in a town she had never been to before, holding a dead man's letter and a key that was older than she was. But she also felt for the first time in as long as she could remember like she was exactly where she was supposed to be. Not assigned there. Not placed there by a form or a caseworker or a judge. Standing there because she had walked through the door herself and chosen to stay. That was the difference. She set the letter back on the desk, carefully smoothing the creases. She picked up the next bundle of letters from the strongbox. Not envelopes these, but folded sheets of paper, the kind torn from a legal pad. She untied the ribbon around them. She recognized the handwriting immediately. But the tone was different. These were not written to her. They were Arthur's own words written to himself in real time. Dated entries the earliest from 2015, the most recent from just over a year ago. She was still reading when the first page made her stop completely. It was a Thursday in October 2019. The entry was 6 lines. "They came again today. Same 2 men, new car, same offer, more zeros. One of them stayed by the truck while the other talked. The one who talked watched my hands the entire time instead of my eyes. That's how you know. The eyes of a man who is threatening you will sometimes drift away when he lies. A man who keeps watching your hands is making sure you're not going to do something he'd have to explain later. I told them to get off the property." The one by the truck smiled as they drove away. She read the next entry, and the next. The pages were a chronicle of years, of a slow and patient siege, of financial pressure applied by invisible hands through legitimate institutions, of the loan, the same loan Edmund had described, taken out not for equipment, or not only for equipment, but as a defensive maneuver, a way to demonstrate to the bank that the property was active and solvent to buy time. And then an entry from the winter of 2022 that made the cold in the office feel suddenly complete. "I've been a fool about one thing. The money from the loan, I took it in cash. I didn't trust the account. I hid it because I thought it was safer that way, and because I had already started to understand that what I was gathering about Northridge was too valuable to leave where they might find it. Under the heart of the mill, where no one will look." Nora stopped reading. She looked out through the glass wall of the office at the main floor, at the saw, at the concrete floor around its massive iron base, the heart of the mill. She stood up slowly, walked out of the office, crossed the main floor, her footsteps deliberate in the sawdust. She stopped beside the base of the great circular saw and looked down at the concrete. It was covered in a thick, even layer of compacted sawdust and decades of grime. At first glance, unbroken, solid. She crouched down and began sweeping the sawdust away with her hands, cold and gritty, smelling of resin. She worked in a slow arc around the base of the iron carriage. Nothing. Solid concrete. She moved further out, and then her fingertips found it. A line, so fine it was nearly imperceptible under the dirt, but perfectly straight. She followed it. Another line perpendicular. A square approximately 2 feet on each side, cut into the concrete with precision. In the center of the square, a small iron ring flush with the floor packed with dirt. She dug the ring out with her fingernails, hooked her fingers through it, pulled. Nothing. She braced her feet flat on the floor, one hand on the ring, the other pressing against the concrete for leverage. She pulled again, hard with her whole body. Something shifted, not much, just a fraction, but it shifted. A scraping sound from beneath. She pulled again. With a grinding, guttural groan, the slab lifted. It was a concrete lid, 4 inches thick, hinged along one edge with a concealed mechanism. Beneath it, darkness and the smell of cold earth and sealed air. Nora pulled the slab all the way open and set it against the iron base of the saw. In the hole below, a large black waterproof case, pelican style with 2 heavy latches on the front. She gripped it by the handle and hauled it out. It was heavy enough to require both hands and every bit of her attention to keep from dropping. She dragged it across the floor to the office doorway and crouched in front of it. 2 latches. She flipped them both, lifted the lid, stacks of currency banded in paper straps. Hundreds. More than she could count at a glance, more than she could have imagined being in one place. The money was real and present and impossible looking the way certain things are when you have lived your whole life in the part of the world where they don't exist. But beneath the stacks of currency, there was something else. A large manila envelope sealed with red wax. Stamped into the wax was the outline of a single pine tree. On the front in Arthur's hand, one word: weapon. Nora sat back on her heels. The rain on the roof continued its patient rhythm. The mill held its silence around her. She looked at the envelope and understood with a clarity that had nothing to do with experience and everything to do with instinct that whatever was inside it was the reason her mother was dead, and the reason she had grown up without a family, and the reason Arthur Calloway had spent the last 15 years of his life building a trap in the only place he trusted. She picked it up carefully. Outside, through the high windows, the light had gone from gray to the deep blue-gray of early evening. The rain had not stopped. Somewhere out in the clearing, the pines moved in the wind, and the sound came through the walls, low and continuous, like breathing. Nora did not open the envelope yet. She set it on the desk beside the strongbox and the photographs and her grandfather's letter. She looked at all of it together. The evidence of a life spent fighting something quietly and alone, leaving everything he had gathered for someone he never got to know, trusting that the blood he had put into this land, in this building, in this careful, painful plan would find the right hands eventually. He had been waiting for her. She picked up her phone again, not Beckett this time. Edmund Hale answered on the fourth ring, his voice alert despite the hour. "Miss Vane." "Mr. Hale," she said, "I need you to come to the mill tonight. Now if you can. There's something under the floor that you need to see." She paused. "And don't talk to anyone about this on your way. No one. Just come." A silence, then, "I'll be there within the hour." She set the phone down. She looked at the envelope marked weapon and the stacks of cash and the letters and the photograph of her mother laughing somewhere young and alive and sharp as a new blade, and she understood that whatever came next was going to be the hardest thing she had ever done. She also understood that she was done being invisible. Edmund Hale arrived 53 minutes after the call. Nora heard his car on the gravel before she saw the headlights sweep across the high windows. She had used the time well. She had found a broom in the corner of the workshop and swept the office floor clean. She had located a small space heater under the desk orange with rust along the base, and after 3 attempts, it had clicked to life and begun pushing warmth into the cold room. She had made coffee on a 2-burner hot plate she found on the filing cabinet, ancient grounds from a tin that had seen better years, but hot. Real. By the time Edmund knocked on the main door, the glass-walled office was the only lit room in the building, a small, warm island inside the dark cathedral of the mill. She let him in. He stood in the doorway for a moment, taking in the scale of the interior, that involuntary pause when the size of a space refuses to be immediately processed. Then he looked at her and then past her to the office, and then at the floor beside the saw, where the concrete lid still rested against the iron base. He was quiet for the walk across the floor. Inside the office, he sat in the visitor's chair and looked at the desk. The open waterproof case, the stacked currency, the manila envelope with the pine tree pressed into the red wax. The strong box opened beside it, the bundled letters inside. He looked at all of it for a long time without speaking. Then very quietly he said, "Arthur, you stubborn, magnificent man." He said it the way you speak to someone who isn't in the room, but whose presence you can still feel in everything around you. Nora pushed the envelope and the letter across the desk toward him. "You need to read it," she said. He read slowly. He was a lawyer, and he read the way lawyers read, attentively, and without rushing, going back when he needed to, making no sound. The space heater ticked. The rain had softened outside. The mill breathed around them. When he finished the letter, he set it down and picked up the manila envelope. He broke the wax seal carefully, like a man who understood that some things once opened could not be closed again. He removed the contents and spread them across the desk. Bank statements. Columns of figures, dates, account numbers with routing codes that didn't match any domestic institution Nora recognized. Property deeds, copies of originals, some with signatures she couldn't read. A notarized affidavit, 12 pages paperclipped together. A photograph, grainy, taken at a distance, of two men in a parking structure, one of them passing a briefcase to the other. Edmund read through all of it. When he finished, he stacked the papers back into their original order and sat with his hands flat on the desk and looked at the wall. "I knew he was under pressure," he said. His voice was careful, measured. "I knew Northridge was applying leverage. Financial, legal. I thought it was aggressive business practice. I told him we could fight it in court." He stopped. "He told me it wasn't that kind of fight. I assumed he was being dramatic." He looked at Nora. "I should not have assumed that." "He didn't want you pulled in," Nora said. "He was protecting you the same way he was protecting me." Edmund looked at her for a moment. "How old are you?" 16 as of this morning." He exhaled slowly. "Right." He looked back at the papers. "This affidavit, do you know who signed it?" "There's a name on the last page. Hargrove. Leonard Hargrove, former accounting director at Northridge. And the note attached to the affidavit says he disappeared in March 2021. Arthur couldn't find him after that." Edmund nodded slowly. His lawyer's mind was moving now. She could see it, the careful architecture of a man sorting information into what it meant and what it could be used for and what it cost to use it. "This is not a property dispute," he said at last. "This is not even close to a property dispute." "I know," Nora said. "These people, if this is accurate and it reads like it is, they are not a development company that cuts corners. They are a criminal organization that uses development as infrastructure. The money laundering alone." He stopped himself. "Nora, do you understand what it means to go against something like this?" "I understand what it means to not go against it," she said. He looked at her steadily, and then he nodded once in the way of a man who has made a decision he knows will complicate the rest of his life. "All right," he said. "We do this carefully, we do this smart, and we do not talk to anyone local." He pulled a notepad from his jacket pocket. "I know an agent at the State Bureau of Investigation in Harrisburg, Willa Fenn. She's been with the Financial Crimes Unit for 11 years. I've worked with her on 2 estate cases that crossed into fraud territory. She's thorough, and she is not connected to anything in this county." He looked up. "The money and the documents don't stay here tonight. We need to move them to a secure location before morning." "There's a bank in Tanner's Ridge," Nora said. She had seen it on the way in, 30 miles east of Millhaven, a town large enough to have a branch of a national institution. "Not local." "Tanner's Ridge," he said. "Yes, that works." He was already writing. "I'll arrange a private vault transfer in the morning. We travel together." He set the pen down. "In the meantime, are you planning to stay here tonight?" "Yes." He studied her. "Is there anything you need?" "I found a cot in the storage room," she said, "and there's coffee." He looked at the hot plate and the ancient tin of grounds with an expression that was almost fond. "Arthur made terrible coffee," he said. "He drank it by the pot regardless." She poured him a cup. He accepted it without complaint. They sat for another hour. Edmund went through the financial documents, methodically making notes in his careful hand, flagging documents he wanted copied before the originals were secured. Nora sat across from him and read more of Arthur's journal entries, the legal pad pages from the strongbox working backward through the years. The picture that assembled itself was patient and dark. Northridge had been circling Millhaven for nearly a decade. Not just Arthur's land, other properties in the county, smaller ones that had sold without resistance. But the Callaway parcel was the one they needed most. The river that ran through its eastern boundary, the Aldermore Creek, sat above an aquifer. The timberland was old growth in sections worth more standing than cut if you knew how to value it in certain markets. And the mill itself, the physical infrastructure, was useful to a laundering operation in ways that Arthur had partially mapped out in his notes. A legitimate business with variable cash flow and equipment expenditures that could absorb large amounts of dirty money without drawing immediate scrutiny. Arthur had understood this before he understood the full scope of who was behind it. By the time he understood both, he had also understood that the legal system in Millhaven County was not a tool he could safely use. Two judges, a sheriff's department with officers who had been on the county payroll for over 20 years. Small towns had long memories and short distances between people, and the distances in Millhaven had been quietly managed for a long time. So he had done it differently. He had gathered, he had documented, he had hidden what he gathered in the one place that belonged entirely to him. And he had waited for someone with nothing to lose and everything to prove to come and find it. When Edmund left close to midnight, the rain had stopped. The night was cold and clear, the kind of clear that happens after rain in November, when the clouds pull back and the temperature drops 5 degrees in an hour. Nora stood in the doorway of the mill and watched his taillights disappear down the gravel road, and then stood for another minute in the silence of the clearing. The stars were extraordinary. She had never lived anywhere that the sky looked like that. She went inside, locked the main door, and slept on the canvas cot in the storage room, with Arthur's jacket over her like a blanket. It smelled of sawdust and motor oil, and something underneath that was simply him, the particular scent of a person that belongs to no category and no description, that exists only in the things they touch daily for a long time. She slept better than she had in 2 years. Morning came in through the high windows at a low angle, November thin and golden. Nora was awake before it fully arrived. She washed her face at the utility sink in the workshop and made more bad coffee and stood in the main floor of the mill drinking it and looking at the machinery. She had made a decision sometime in the night in the uncertain territory between thinking and sleeping. She was not going to simply wait for the legal process to move. She was not going to sit in the office and watch Edmund file documents and Agent Fenn open preliminary inquiries. The mill was hers, the land was hers, and if she was going to fight for it, she needed to understand what she was fighting for. She needed to understand the mill. She went to the workshop. Arthur's hand tools hung on the wall in careful rows, each one on its own peg. Each peg labeled in his handwriting with a small strip of masking tape. Chisels, planes, mallets, marking gauges, spoke shaves, a set of handsaws, graded from rip to crosscut, their teeth still sharp enough to catch the light. On the workbench, the unfinished carving. A hawk in mid-flight wings extended carved from a block of dense figured walnut. The feathers along the leading edge of one wing were roughed in but unfinished, the detail work incomplete. The tools that had been working on it were still laid out beside it exactly as they had been set down. She did not touch the carving. Not yet. She found the journals on the shelf above the workbench. 8 of them, cloth-bound, filled from cover to cover in Arthur's handwriting. Not the letters, not the surveillance notes. These were something entirely different. These were the working journals of a craftsman. Technical, specific, beautiful in the way that expertise is beautiful when it doesn't know it is. She pulled the earliest one down and sat on the workshop stool and began to read. The first entry was from 1986, the year the mill opened. Arthur had written several pages about the properties of eastern white pine, the primary timber species on his land. He described the grain, the density, the way moisture content affected the cut, the difference in behavior between heartwood and sapwood. He described the adjustment of the main blade for different stock thicknesses, the calibration of the feed rollers, the mathematics of board feet yield per log depending on diameter and length, and how much you were willing to lose to kerf. He wrote about the sound of a good cut versus a bad one. He wrote a dull blade doesn't scream. It complains. There's a difference, and you learn it with your body before you learn it with your mind. Nora read for an hour. Then she put the journal down and walked out into the main floor and stood in front of the mill machinery and looked at it differently than she had the night before. She started with the machine bander in the workshop. It was smaller than the main saw, a standalone unit designed for resawing smaller stock running a narrow blade on two wheels. She found the manual for it in the filing cabinet in the office, a photocopied document held together with a rusted binder clip. She read it at the desk. Then she went back to the machine and identified every component the manual described, working through the terminology, the way you work through a foreign language, for the first time slowly with attention, allowing the logic of it to emerge. She found the oil ports. She found the tension adjustment for the blade. She checked the tracking. She found the blade itself still sharp enough to use. She found the power disconnect for the workshop circuit on the breaker panel inside the door. She switched it on. The fluorescent lights above the workshop bench buzzed and steadied. She found the switch for the bander. She held her hand near the blade housing. She turned it on. The machine vibrated and hummed, and the blade began to move slowly at first, and then at speed, a thin steel loop running in a clean circle between the two wheels. The sound filled the workshop, not loud, not aggressive, but alive, mechanical and purposeful. Nora stood beside it for a long moment and listened. Then she found a piece of scrap pine in the bin near the door, rough cut about 2 inches square. She held it to the fence and fed it slowly into the blade. The cut was clean, the kerf was narrow. The two pieces fell apart on the outfeed table, and she picked them up and looked at the faces. Smooth, almost plain-looking, the grain of the wood running straight across the width. She did it again with another piece, and again. By mid-morning, she had worked through the scrap bin and moved on to a rough-cut board from the edge of one of the stacks in the main floor. She was not making anything in particular. She was learning the machine, learning how the feed rate affected the finish, learning how to hold the stock flat against the fence without forcing it, learning the difference between guiding the wood and fighting it. She was so absorbed that she didn't hear the car on the gravel. She didn't hear the footsteps on the path outside either. The first thing she heard was the knock on the main door, 3 measured impacts, unhurried and confident. She shut off the bander. The silence that followed was immediate and complete. She walked to the main door and opened it. The man standing on the other side was somewhere in his mid-50s, though he wore it expensively. Gray suit, no tie, the top button of his shirt undone. Shoes that had no business being on a gravel path in rural Pennsylvania. He was not physically imposing, but he had a quality of stillness about him, the kind that comes not from calm, but from control, from a person who has spent years ensuring that nothing happens around him that he did not authorize. "Miss Vane," he said. His voice was smooth, the consonants precise. "My name is Harlan Strom. I'm the Director of Development at Northridge Corporation. I apologize for arriving without an appointment. I was in the area and I thought a personal introduction was overdue." He smiled. It was technically a smile. It reached his mouth. "I know who you are," Nora said. "Then you know I represent a substantial and sincere offer for this property." He looked past her into the interior of the mill without being invited to a casual glance that took in more than it appeared to. "I'd like the chance to speak with you directly, one-to-one, without lawyers involved." He looked back at her. "I think you'll find I'm a reasonable man." "Mr. Strom," Nora said, "I've read enough about reasonable men in the last 12 hours to last me a while." Something shifted in his face, barely a tightening around the eyes. "You've been going through your grandfather's papers, I imagine." Arthur was a complicated man. He had some ideas about Northridge that I'd like the chance to address personally. I think there are some misunderstandings that— "I'm not selling," Nora said. Strom was quiet for a moment. He looked at her with an expression she recognized, not anger, not yet, but the measuring look of a person recalibrating. She was not what he had expected. She could see him deciding what that meant. Miss Vane, he said, you're 16 years old. You've inherited a property with significant debt that you have no immediate means to service. The bank's timeline is not flexible. I've worked with properties in exactly this situation many times, and the outcome when the bank forecloses is never good for the original owner. I'm offering you a path that protects you. He paused. I'd hate to see you lose everything simply because of pride. Is that what happened to my mother? Nora said. She lost everything because of pride. The silence that followed was a different kind than any that had come before it. It was not empty. It was full of the thing neither of them said. Strom looked at her for a long moment. The smile was entirely gone now. Everything has a price eventually, Miss Vane, he said. I hope you'll reconsider. He turned and walked back to his car. A black sedan, two men visible through the windshield. The car pulled out of the clearing without haste, the way a thing moves when it knows it will be back. Nora closed the door and stood in the silence of the mill and breathed. Then she went back to the bander and turned it on and kept working. Beckett Dern came by in the afternoon with 2 bags of groceries and a thermos of actual coffee from the diner on Main Street. He set them on the office desk without ceremony and looked at the sawdust on Nora's clothes and the stack of finished boards she had leaned against the workshop wall. You've been running the bander, he said, since this morning. He looked at the boards. He picked one up and examined the cut face running his thumb along it. He set it back without comment, but something in the set of his expression had changed. Arthur started on that same machine, he said, 38 years ago. He left without pressing for information. At the door he stopped. Black sedan been parked at the end of the road since about noon, he said, facing the property. I know, Nora said. You want me to call anyone? Not yet. He nodded and left. That evening Edmund called. The vault arrangement in Tanner's Ridge was confirmed. He would collect the case and the documents in the morning. He had reached out to Agent Willa Fenn at the SBI, not directly through an intermediary, carefully. Fenn was available and willing to meet, but it would need to be in Harrisburg, not here. Strom came this morning, Nora told him. A pause. In person. Yes. What did he say? The standard version. Debt timeline, reasonable man. She paused. I mentioned my mother. He didn't like that. Another pause longer. Nora, be careful what you say to him directly. He'll use anything. I know. She looked out the office window at the darkening main floor. Mr. Hale, in Arthur's journals, the working ones, not the surveillance notes he wrote about a loan, not the 2019 loan, an older one, from 1988, cash, no documentation. Edmund was quiet. He wrote that he didn't understand who he was borrowing from at the time, Nora said. He thought it was a private investor, someone who believed in the mill. Nora, the name he used in the most recent entries, she said. When he finally put it together, he wrote Harlan Strom. The man who offered me $60,000 in the winter of 1988 is the man in the suit today. The silence on Edmund's end of the line was long and careful. He's not trying to buy the property, Nora said. He's trying to close a loop, the mill, the evidence, all of it. It's connected to something that started 36 years ago. He loaned Arthur money he couldn't refuse, and he's been collecting on it ever since. My mother found out how far it went. That's why she called Arthur the week before she died. She had the financial records that proved what the original loan actually was. Edmund exhaled slowly. How did Arthur know all of this? He didn't at first. He pieced it together over years. The last journal entry about Strom specifically is from 14 months ago. He wrote, I've been a fool about one thing. I should have seen it in 1988 when the cash arrived with no paperwork and no questions. A man who asks no questions has already answered them for himself. All right, Edmund said. His voice was steady, but she could hear the weight behind it. This changes the scope of what we bring to Fenn. This isn't just money laundering and a predatory acquisition. This is a multi-decade criminal conspiracy that includes... He stopped. The original death, he said carefully. Yes, Nora said. A long pause, then, lock the doors tonight, both of them. Don't open for anyone but me in the morning. She agreed and hung up. She did not sleep as well the second night. Not because of fear exactly, though the black sedan Beckett had mentioned was somewhere in her mind like a stone in a shoe. It was more that the shape of the thing she was inside had become clearer, and clarity about something this large was not a comfortable feeling. She lay on the cot in the storage room with Arthur's jacket over her and listened to the sounds of the mill, the tick of the cooling metal, the groan of the timber frame as the temperature dropped, the occasional percussion of a pine branch in the wind against the siding. She thought about her mother, about Della Calloway at 38 sharp as a new blade, finding something in a set of financial records and calling her father from wherever she was and saying, "I found it. I know what they are." And 3 days later, Nora pressed that thought down and focused on the ceiling. In the morning, she was back in the workshop before full light. She had moved on from the bander. Arthur's journals had described the main saw's operating procedure in detail across 3 separate entries, and she had read all 3 twice. She was not ready to run the main blade alone. The scale of it demanded a second person for safe operation, but she could study the mechanism. She could trace the path of power from the motor through the drive belt to the arbor, could identify the blade guards in the anti-kickback system, could locate the emergency stop on 3 sides of the machine. She was crouched beside the main drive motor reading the data plate when she heard the creak of the main door. She stood up. Beckett Dern came across the floor with his hands in his pockets and a look on his face that was somewhere between impressed and concerned. He stopped beside her and looked at the motor housing, and then at the journal she had open on the conveyor table beside her. "You're reading Arthur's technical logs," he said. "I'm trying to understand the machine." He was quiet for a moment. He looked at the main blade, the carriage, the log deck. Then he looked at her. "I worked this mill for 11 years, he said, starting 1987. I ran this saw 6 days a week for most of that time." He paused. "If you want, I can show you how it operates. Properly. From the beginning." Nora looked at him. "Why?" "Because Arthur spent 30 years building it," Beckett said. "And because I've been watching that black sedan at the end of your road for 2 days, and I'd rather be useful than worried." They spent 4 hours on the main saw. Beckett walked her through every system methodically, the way a person teaches something they know so well they have to reconstruct it from first principles to explain it. He showed her the blade alignment procedure, the tension test, the way to read the tracking by watching the blade's movement under no-load conditions. He showed her how to set the fence for a given board width, how to calculate the feed rate for different species, how the log deck's hydraulic lift had been modified by Arthur from its original design to improve the loading angle. Nora asked questions and took notes in the margin of Arthur's journal. At noon, Beckett said, "You want to make a cut?" "Yes," she said. He selected a log from the deck, not a large one, perhaps a foot in diameter and 8 feet long, a section of red oak that had been waiting there long enough to be fully seasoned. He showed her how to position it on the deck, how to engage the hydraulic lift, how to set the carriage stop for the desired board thickness. He stood at the controls. Nora stood at the outfeed end where the board would emerge. He started the main motor. The sound that filled the mill was extraordinary. The blade spun up from silence to operating speed in about 6 seconds, and the sound it made at full speed was not a scream or a roar, but something deeper and more continuous, a sustained note in the lower registers that you felt in your chest as much as heard with your ears. The building seemed to resonate with it. The dust on the conveyor tables trembled. Beckett advanced the carriage. The log moved toward the blade. Contact, a change in pitch, a brief increase in amplitude, and then the saw was cutting, and the sound leveled into a clean, purposeful tone, and a red oak board 12 feet long and 2 inches thick slid out on the outfeed table in front of Nora in one smooth movement. She put her hands flat on it. The wood was warm from the friction of the cut. The face was clean. The grain ran in long, even lines across the width, the kind of figure that takes decades to grow. She stood with her hands on that board and did not say anything for a moment. She thought he made this. This is what he spent 30 years building. Not the building, not the machine. This, the board. The specific, irreplaceable object made from a specific tree that grew in this specific ground. From outside, distantly, she heard the sound of another car on the gravel road. Then another. She looked up at the high windows. Beckett had shut the saw down. The silence was sudden and total. Through the window, she could see the clearing. 3 vehicles on the road outside, 2 of them pickup trucks. People climbing out. Standing at the tree line, not approaching, just looking at the mill. An older man she didn't recognize. A woman in a ranch coat. A younger man with his hands in his pockets. Word got around, Beckett said from the controls. Mill running again. He paused. People remember. Nora looked at the small gathering at the edge of the clearing. At the mill around her. At the board still warm under her hands. Then she heard her phone ring. Edmund. I'm in Tanner's Ridge, he said. The vault is arranged. I need you to bring the case tonight. A pause. And Nora, I heard from Fenn. She'll see us the day after tomorrow in Harrisburg. But Nora, his voice shifted. Something came through this morning. Northridge filed an emergency injunction with the county court. They're claiming the property is at risk of asset dissipation and requesting a temporary receivership order. Nora was quiet. It means they're trying to get a judge to appoint a neutral party to manage the property while the debt dispute is pending, Edmund said. If they succeed, you lose control of the mill and the land without them having to purchase it at all. He paused. The judge assigned is Douglas Creel. Nora thought of Arthur's notes, the careful documentation of which institutions in Millhaven County had been quietly managed over a long time. The bank, the court system. Can we fight the injunction, she asked. We can, Edmund said. But not here, not in this county. We need to be in front of Fenn before Creel rules. A pause. Nora, how fast can you be ready to move? She looked at the warm board under her hands, at the mill around her, at Beckett Dern watching her from the saw controls with the expression of a man waiting to see what kind of decision she was about to make. She thought of Arthur in 1988 accepting $60,000 in cash from a man who asked no questions. She thought of her mother in 2009 calling from somewhere with documents in her hand and the conviction that she had found something worth exposing. She thought about the black sedan at the end of the road. Tomorrow morning, she said. I'll be ready. She hung up and looked at Beckett. I need a favor, she said. He was quiet for a moment. Something moved across his face. Not reluctance exactly, but the expression of a man checking something internal before committing. Then he reached into his jacket and produced a thermos and set it on the conveyor table. My wife's going to have questions, he said. I'll deal with those tomorrow. He didn't say anything else and didn't need to. The drive to Harrisburg took 3 hours and 40 minutes. Edmund drove. Nora sat in the passenger seat with Arthur's journals in her lap and watched Pennsylvania move past the window. The bare fields, the gray river, the long stretches of interstate that made everything feel both connected and very far from where she needed to be. Edmund had collected the waterproof case from the mill the previous evening. It was in the trunk, now secured in a hard-sided bag. The manila envelope, the affidavit, the bank statements, all of it copied twice. One set in the trunk, one set in a separate bag in the back seat. Edmund had learned across 40 years of estate law that the most important documents in the world had a way of disappearing when there was only one copy. They did not talk much on the drive. What needed to be said had been said. What hadn't been said yet would wait for the room they were driving toward. The State Bureau of Investigation's regional office in Harrisburg occupied the 4th floor of a building that looked exactly like every other building on that block. Beige stone vertical windows, the architectural language of institutional permanence. A place designed to communicate that it would outlast whatever you brought to it. Agent Willa Fenn met them in a conference room on the interior side of the floor, no windows. She was in her mid-40s with close-cropped dark hair and the particular economy of movement that belonged to people who spent their professional lives deciding what mattered and discarding everything else. She shook Edmund's hand and looked at Nora without the assessment Nora was used to, not cataloging her as a minor or a problem to be managed, just looking. With the attention of someone making a genuine evaluation. "Mr. Hale tells me you've brought documentation," she said. "Yes," Nora said. They spread it on the conference table. Fenn read without interrupting. She turned pages at her own pace, went back twice to the affidavit, held the bank statements up to the fluorescent light at one point, as if testing whether they were real. She looked at the photograph of the two men in the parking structure for a long time. When she finished, she stacked everything neatly and set it in front of her and looked across the table. "This is a serious accusation against a corporation with significant legal resources," she said. "And the primary source of your documentation is a deceased individual whose mental state Northridge will almost certainly attempt to characterize as deteriorated in his final years." "Arthur Calloway was not deteriorating," Edmund said. "I know that, and you know that," Fenn said. "Their lawyers will argue otherwise. That's not a legal opinion, it's a tactical preview." She looked at Nora. "You found all of this yourself?" "Yes." "Walk me through it," Nora told her. She told it the way Arthur had written his journal entries, specific, sequential, without embellishment. The box in Edmund's office, the iron key, the cardboard box on the desk, the journals, the strong box, the letters, the trap door beneath the main saw. She described the dimensions of the concrete lid, the weight of it, the smell of the sealed air underneath. Fenn listened without writing anything down. She was one of those people who recorded with their attention rather than their hands. "The injunction filed this morning," Edmund said, "in Millhaven County Court, Judge Douglas Creel presiding." Fenn's expression didn't change, but something behind it did. A small, precise shift. "Creel," she said. "You know him?" Nora asked. "His name has appeared in 3 separate preliminary inquiries in the last 4 years," Fenn said carefully, "none of which advanced to formal investigation." She paused. "That's information I'm sharing with you as context, not as established fact. Do you understand the difference?" "Yes," Nora said. "If Northridge is filing through Creel's court, they expect a favorable ruling, quickly." Fenn looked at the documents. "How long before he rules on the receivership motion?" 72 hours at most," Edmund said. "Possibly less." Fenn was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "I'm going to open a preliminary inquiry. That's what I can do today. It doesn't freeze the county proceedings, but it creates a federal record that makes a favorable ruling in Creel's court significantly more complicated for everyone involved." She looked at Nora. "I want you to understand what a preliminary inquiry means. It means we're at the beginning of something that will take time. Months, possibly longer. It is not an arrest. It is not a resolution. It is the first step of a process." "Hold on all night." Shh. "I understand," Nora said. "Northridge will know within 24 hours that we've opened this," Fenn said. "They have enough connection to enough people that information moves. When they know, they will escalate their pressure on you. Not physically, most likely that creates risk they'll want to avoid with a federal inquiry open. But financially, legally, through the media if they can manage it." She looked at Edmund. "She'll need representation that goes beyond a state law." "I've already made 2 calls," Edmund said. Fenn looked back at Nora. "Is there anything else? Anything that isn't in these documents that Arthur left you that might be relevant?" Nora thought of the hawk, the unfinished carving on the workshop bench, the tools laid out beside it exactly as they had been set down. She didn't know yet. She wasn't ready to name it until she did. "Not yet," she said. Fenn nodded. She gathered the documents and stood. "I'll need originals for the file. You'll keep your copies." She paused at the door. "Miss Vane, your grandfather spent a long time building this case alone. That was the right instinct given his circumstances. You don't have to build yours alone." She said it simply, without sentiment. It was the most useful thing anyone had said to Nora in 2 days. The drive back to Millhaven took 4 hours. Rain again, the kind that set in for the afternoon and made no promises about stopping. Edmund dropped her at the mill with groceries from a market in the next town, and a tarp he had in his trunk that he used to cover the open window frame on the workshop's south wall, which Nora had identified as a point of entry and mentioned to him twice. He nailed it in place himself, working methodically in the rain with a hammer from the workshop and roofing nails from a can on the shelf. When he was done, he stood in the workshop doorway and looked at Nora. "You should come and stay with Margaret and me," he said. Margaret was his wife. He had mentioned her twice briefly in the way of a person who considers their home a given resource in a situation like this. "We have a spare room. It would be safer." "I need to be here," Nora said. He looked at her for a moment. He did not push. He had learned in the past 48 hours that pushing Nora Vane was approximately as effective as pushing the main saw. "Lock the doors," he said. "Both of them. Call me if anything happens." He left. Nora stood in the workshop alone. The rain on the tarp made a low, continuous percussion. The fluorescent light above the bench buzzed steadily. She looked at the hawk on the workbench, at the unfinished wing, at the tools laid out beside it in Arthur's careful arrangement. She sat down on the stool and picked up the smallest gouge. She turned it in her hands. The handle was smooth from decades of use, the grain of the wood worn to a polish by the specific geography of Arthur's grip. She set it down. She looked at the hawk. She had read enough of the technical journals to understand the basics of relief carving. She had absorbed Arthur's approach through his notes, the way he described leaving material, rather than removing it, the way he talked about the wood having a direction and the carver's job being to find it rather than impose on it. She was not a carver. She had no training. But the wing was roughed in the major planes established. The detail work that remained was in the feathers, the individual barbs of the leading edge. She picked up the gouge again. She made the first cut, carefully following the line Arthur had begun, extending it by perhaps a quarter inch. The walnut was dense and clean. The tool moved through it with a resistance that was almost satisfying, like the wood was testing whether she was serious. She made another cut, and another. She was not thinking about Northridge. She was not thinking about Strom or Fenn or the injunction or the county court. She was thinking about the angle of the tool and the direction of the grain and the shape that was already in the wood waiting to be made visible. She was thinking the way Arthur's journals described thinking, when the work was going well, not in words exactly, but in the language of hand and material and the slow negotiation between them. She worked for 2 hours. When she finally set the gouge down and looked at what she had done, the feathers of the leading edge were finished. Not perfectly. There were places where her cuts were tentative, where the depth was uneven. But the hawk's wing was complete and it looked like a wing. She turned the carving over to attach the base piece. Arthur had prepared it separately, a flat oval of walnut shaped and sanded with a shallow mortise, cut to receive the tenon on the hawk's underside. She fitted them together. The joint was tight and clean. Something shifted under her hands. She turned the base over. The underside of the base had been hollowed. Not the full depth, the walls were solid and substantial, but in the center a cylindrical void approximately 2 inches in diameter and 3 inches deep, sealed with a small circular plug of matching walnut, set flush with the surface and finished to match. It was invisible unless you knew to look for it, unless you had the piece upside down in your hands. Nora took a thin chisel from the wall. She worked the edge carefully around the circumference of the plug. It was not glued. It was fitted precisely the friction of a perfect joint holding it in place. She worked it loose by degrees and then it came free in her palm. Inside the void, a piece of paper folded twice the size of a playing card. She unfolded it. Arthur's handwriting. Small, careful, more compressed than the letters, as if he had known the space was limited and calibrated accordingly. "If you finish the hawk, you're more like me than I had the right to hope." Below the Millhaven line, Route 9 East, 14 miles, the town of Alderton. Ask at the lumber yard on Garrison Street for Vern Osley. Tell him Arthur sent you. He will not want to talk. He will talk anyway. He was there, Nora. On Route 209, the night your mother died. He saw the car that followed her. He's been carrying it for 14 years. He needs someone to ask him the right question. Nora read it twice. Then she sat very still in the workshop with the rain on the tarp and the fluorescent light buzzing overhead, and 14 years of silence about to end. She called Edmund at 9 in the evening. He listened without interrupting. When she finished reading him the note, he was quiet for a long time. "Vern Osley," he said finally. "Do you know him?" The name, from a long time ago. He drove for a logging contractor out of Alderton. He would have been on Route 209 regularly. A pause. "Nora, if he witnessed what Arthur believed he witnessed, then my mother's death is a homicide," Nora said, "and Strom is connected to it." Another long pause. "I'm going to call Fenn tonight," Edmund said, "before you go anywhere near Alderton." "Call her," Nora agreed, "but I'm going in the morning." He didn't argue. He had learned. Fenn called back within the hour. She asked 3 questions, listened to Nora's answers, and said, "Don't go alone. Take Mr. Hale. And Nora, don't tell Osley anything about the inquiry. Just ask him what he saw. Let him tell it in his own words." The lumber yard on Garrison Street in Alderton opened at 7. Edmund drove. They arrived at 7:15. Vern Osley was 61 years old and looked like a man who had been carrying something heavy for a long time and had learned to walk in a way that didn't show it. He was behind the counter when they came in checking an order form, and when Edmund said his name, he looked up with the particular expression of someone who has been waiting for a knock on a door they hope would never come. Nora stepped forward. "Arthur Calloway sent me," she said. Osley looked at her for a long moment. Then he looked at Edmund, then back at Nora. "Arthur's gone," he said. "I know," she said. "I'm his granddaughter, and I found your name." He set the order form down. He came around the counter. He gestured toward a small office at the back of the yard, a room with a space heater and 2 folding chairs, and a window that looked out at a stack of pressure-treated lumber. They sat down. Vern Osley talked for 40 minutes. He talked the way a person talks when they have rehearsed something in their head for years and finally have an audience, not fluently, not easily, but completely. Every detail in its place, every moment accounted for, because he had never let himself forget any of it. He had been driving his rig back from a delivery on Route 209 on a March night 14 years ago. Clear night, dry road, no weather. He saw the car ahead of him, a small sedan driving normally, keeping the speed limit, and then a second car, dark-colored, that came up fast behind the sedan and stayed close. Too close. For about half a mile, and then the sedan went off the road at the curve above Hatchet Creek. He had stopped. He had looked down into the ravine. He had seen the car below, upside down, the headlights still on. And then the dark car had pulled up beside his rig, and a window had come down, and a man had looked up at him from the driver's seat, and the man had not said a word. He had just looked at Osley for about 5 seconds, and then he had driven away. Osley had called 911. He had given his location. He had waited for the ambulance. He had not told the responding officer about the second car, because by the time the officer arrived and was asking questions, Osley had already understood from the 5 seconds of that look what kind of person had been in that car and what it meant that the person had seen his face. He had not told anyone in 14 years. Nora asked him one question when he finished. "The man in the dark car, if you saw him again, would you know him?" Osley looked at her. "I'd know him," he said. "I've seen his picture in the paper twice since then. Development company, big projects, same eyes." Edmund made 2 calls from the parking lot of the lumberyard before they reached the car. The first to Fenn, the second to a colleague in Harrisburg whose practice was criminal law and who owed Edmund a favor from a complicated estate case 7 years prior. By the time they pulled out of Alderton, Osley had agreed to provide a formal statement to the SBI, and Fenn had dispatched an agent to take it. The weeks that followed were not dramatic in the way that endings are sometimes imagined to be. They were grinding and precise and exhausting in a way that had no visible shape from the inside. Legal motions filed in Harrisburg courts that superseded the county proceeding. Creel's receivership order challenged and stayed by a federal judge before it could take effect. Northridge's legal team expanding, and then after the scope of the federal inquiry became public, contracting as individual attorneys quietly withdrew from representation. Nora stayed at the mill. Edmund and Margaret had stopped asking her to stay with them, And instead, Margaret began appearing at the mill on alternate afternoons, with food in containers in a manner that was warm without being intrusive, the manner of a woman who understood that some people needed to be in a specific place in order to remain themselves. Orvis Gant came on a Wednesday morning in the second week. He was 74, compact, with the deliberate hands of a man who had spent his career in proximity to machinery that didn't tolerate carelessness. He had worked the Callaway mill for 9 years, he told Nora. He had been there the day it shut down. He had thought about it most days since. He walked the main floor with her and did not speak for several minutes. He looked at the machinery the way you look at something you once knew so well that its absence has been a physical weight you carry daily without naming it. "You've been running the bander," he said. "For about a week," Nora said. "And the main saw. Beckett Dern walked me through the systems. We made a cut." Orvis looked at her. Then he looked at the main saw. "You want to run a full session?" he asked. "Proper, log to board, the whole sequence." "Yes," she said. They spent 3 days on it. Orvis worked the controls while Nora ran the outfeed and learned the rhythm of the process: the log deck, the carriage, the blade, the board emerging and being transferred to the stacking area. On the second day, she moved to the controls. On the third day, she ran the full sequence herself, with Orvis standing 20 feet back watching, offering correction in brief, precise sentences when it was needed. At the end of the third day, there was a stack of red oak boards 12 feet long and 2 inches thick at the east end of the main floor. 22 boards. Nora had cut every one. Orvis looked at the stack for a long time. "Arthur would have something to say about that," he said. "What would he say?" Nora asked. Orvis thought about it. "Nothing," he said finally. "He'd just keep working. That's what he said when something went right." He kept going. The day Harlan Strom was brought in for questioning at the SBI's Harrisburg office, Nora was in the mill running the bander. She found out from Edmund by phone at noon. She set the phone on the conveyor table and stood in the main floor for a long while and then went back to work. 3 days later, Fenn called and said they needed her in Harrisburg, not for a preliminary interview this time, for a formal proceeding. She drove with Edmund. She wore the same clothes she had worn to Edmund's office 2 weeks before. She had not accumulated many alternatives. In the elevator going up, Edmund straightened his tie and looked at her and said nothing, which was the right thing. The room was larger than the conference room where she had met Fenn. A longer table, more chairs. Strom was at the far end with 3 attorneys arranged around him, their suits all belonging to the same expensive register. Strom himself looked exactly as he had in the clearing outside the mill, contained the stillness of a man who had been in difficult rooms before and believed he would be in them again. Nora sat across the table, Edmund beside her, Fenn at the head. She had brought one thing: the photograph from the box in the cardboard carton, Arthur in his 40s standing in front of the half-built mill the year of his life, when everything was still being constructed and the outcome was not yet certain. She set it on the table in front of her. Strom looked at it. His expression did not change. Fenn began the formal proceeding. The legal language of it was careful and precise and took several minutes to establish what was already obvious in the room. Nora waded through it. She had learned to wait. When Fenn finished the opening statement, she nodded at Nora. Nora looked at Strom directly. She looked at him with the particular calm of someone who has spent days deciding they are done being afraid. "He built that with nothing but his hands," she said. She touched the photograph. 30 years of his life. He built it because he believed that if you made something real, something that lasted, it belonged to you in a way that couldn't be taken. She paused. "You gave him the money to finish it in 1988. Not because you believed in it, because you wanted to own the man who built it." She looked at the photograph and then back at Strom. "You built yours on stolen land in a dead woman's silence. My mother found that out, and now everyone in this room knows it." She left a space. "Let's see which one the law remembers." Strom's attorneys began speaking. The proceedings continued for another 2 hours. Nora said what she needed to say and answered what she was asked, and sat through the rest with her hands flat on the table and the photograph in front of her. At the end, when the room was dispersing, Fen stopped beside Nora at the door. She didn't say anything for a moment. Then your grandfather kept good records. He was a craftsman, Nora said. He understood that the quality of the work is in the details. Fen almost smiled. Yes, she said. Strom was arrested on the steps of the building as he left. Edmund found Nora at the car. He did not say anything for a moment. He just looked at her the way he had looked at the documents the first night in the mill, with the attention of a man making sure he understood what he was seeing. Then he unlocked the car, and they got in, and he drove them out of Harrisburg, and neither of them spoke for the first 40 minutes. There was nothing that needed to be said that the silence didn't already contain. Somewhere past the third exit off the interstate, Nora put her head back against the headrest and closed her eyes. Not sleeping, just still. For the first time in weeks, she allowed herself to be still. Her mother's name lived in her chest the way it always had a permanent resident, taking up exactly as much room as it needed. But the weight of it had changed. It was not lighter. It was different. It had become the weight of something that had been witnessed rather than something that was only hers to carry alone. The indictments came over the following 6 weeks, not all at once. The way a structure fails not in a single collapse, but in a sequence, each element giving way in the order that the investigation had mapped. Strom on racketeering, money laundering conspiracy charges that carried provisions allowing the federal case to fold in the Millhaven County connections. 2 Northridge executives on related financial charges. A third on obstruction. And then on a Thursday morning in early January, Douglas Creel resigned from the county bench. No statement, no press conference. He was gone by afternoon. The bank debt against the Callaway property was voided by federal court order, the debt itself having been established through a fraudulent scheme in which First Millhaven Savings Bank had acted as an instrument of coercion. The bank's president, a man named Garrett Binns, who had held the position for 16 years, was indicted on 2 counts of financial fraud. The debt did not transfer, did not survive, did not exist. The mill and the land were Nora's unencumbered, in the full legal sense of the word. Vern Osley's statement reopened the investigation into Della Callaway's death. The case was reclassified as a suspected homicide. It would take more time, more evidence, more forensic work, the patient archaeology of a crime committed 14 years ago on a road that no longer had the same guardrails. Nora was told not to expect a quick resolution. She told the detective who informed her that she understood, and she meant it. She had learned something about the relationship between justice and time that most people didn't learn until they were much older. She did not get back everything that had been taken. That was not the shape of what happened. Her mother was still gone. The 14 years were still gone. Those were not the kinds of losses that cases resolved or injunctions reversed. She understood this with a clarity that was painful and also in a strange way steadying. Grief without illusion was cleaner than grief that hoped for something it couldn't have. What she had was the mill. The afternoon the legal confirmation arrived, Edmund drove out to deliver it in person. The formal documents, the court order, the notation of the debt discharge, the weather had broken. A January thaw rare for Pennsylvania, the temperature climbing into the high 40s, and the sky coming out pale and luminous after weeks of gray. Edmund walked the main floor with her. He looked at the stack of oak boards at the east end of the space, at the clean machinery at the sawdust swept, and the conveyor belts cleaned of their years of accumulation. At the bander running in the workshop which Nora had left on when she heard his car. At the hawk on the workbench finished, and solid on its base wings extended, caught in the posture of something about to rise. He stood in front of the hawk for a long time. He started this a year ago, Edmund said, right around the time he wrote the final version of the will. I know, Nora said. He knew, I think, that he was running out of time. Edmund touched the wing with one finger, the finished feathers along the leading edge. He always finished what he started. Everything except this. He left it for me to finish, Nora said. He was telling me something. Edmund looked at her. What? That the work doesn't stop because the person does, she said. That it gets handed to someone else. That's the whole point. She paused. The hawk, the mill, the case. He built what he could, and then he trusted someone to carry the rest. Edmund was quiet. He looked at the hawk and then at Nora, and she could see the same thing in his face that she had seen in Beckett's face on the first day when she had asked to see the mill before making any decisions. A recognition of something he hadn't expected. "What are you going to do with it?" he asked. "Not just the mill, all of it." "Run it," she said. "Properly." Orvis said he'd come back full time. Beckett knows the logging operation on the North Acreage. There's old growth timber up there that hasn't been touched in 40 years. Arthur left it deliberately. I'm going to leave it alone too. The rest is working forest. Sustainable yield the way Arthur was running it before the pressure started. She paused. "And I want to build the furniture side." He had designs in the journals. Chairs, tables, architectural millwork. Local materials hand-finished. There's a real market for it, Edmund. People who understand what it means when something is made well. Shush. Edmund looked at her for a long moment. Then he said, "You sound like him." "I know," she said. "I think that was the idea." He left before dark. Nora stood in the doorway of the mill and watched his car go down the gravel road and disappear at the tree line. Then she stood for a while in the open air of the clearing. The thaw had brought a smell up from the ground, the particular smell of cold earth beginning to release green and mineral and very old, the smell of something that had been waiting under the surface for the season to change. The 112 acres of the Callaway timberland were out there in the early dark, the old growth standing as it had stood for 100 years unhurried, making no argument for itself. Simply present in the way that things are present when they have learned to outlast everything that comes for them. She thought about her mother, about Della Callaway at 20, before any of this growing up on this land, running these paths, knowing the names of the trees. She thought about what it meant that this was the ground Della had grown up on, and that Della had gone away and come back and found the thing that needed to be found and paid the price for it, and left without meaning to the most important thing she had to leave. Nora. She went into the workshop. She sat at the bench. She moved the hawk carefully to the corner shelf where it would be safe, wings up, head forward, the posture of something that has already decided where it is going, and opened Arthur's final technical journal to the first blank page. She took a pen from the coffee can beside the bench. She wrote the date at the top of the page. Then she wrote her name, Nora Callaway Vane. And below it, in the small, careful handwriting she had been practicing, without knowing it, for the past 2 weeks, trying to match the quality of attention that filled every page of the journal she had been living inside. Red oak. First full session January thaw. 22 boards 2 inches by 12 feet. Blade tension adjusted for hardwood. Feed rate reduced by 15% from softwood settings. Grain ran clean on all cuts. Some variation in color from heartwood to sapwood keeps separate for finishing purposes. The mill is loud when it's working. Loud and right. She stopped, read it back, thought about the sound the blade made when it was up to speed, that deep, sustained note that filled the building and vibrated in the trusses and moved through the floor into the soles of her feet, into her hands when she pressed them flat on the outfeed table, into her chest, when she stood still enough to let it. She wrote one more line. This is what he built. This is what it sounds like when it's working. I'm going to learn every part of it. She capped the pen, set it down, looked at the workshop around her, the tools in their rows, the machines under their tarps, the shelves of journals with their cloth spines and their decades of accumulated knowledge, the sawdust that would never fully be gone from any surface in this building, because it was too far into the wood itself, now too much a part of what the place was. Outside, the last of the January light was going. The clearing would be pale and cold, the tree line dark against a sky the color of old pewter. The 112 acres of the Callaway timberland would be settling into evening the way they had settled into every evening for the 100 years before any of this, quietly, without urgency, with the patience of things that grow slowly and last a long time. Nora left the workshop, light on, and walked out into the main floor. She stood in the center of it, where the light from the high windows fell across the concrete floor in long, fading angles. She looked at the great saw and its carriage blade, Still the iron dark and solid and waiting. She put her hand flat on the steel, cold the way it was always cold, dense and permanent and shaped to cut through the hardest things cleanly. She had come here with a black trash bag and an iron key and the name of a man she had never met. She had found in the silence of a building that had been waiting for someone to come back to it the story of everything that had been done for her before she was old enough to know it needed doing. She had found the proof of a love so determined to protect her that it had chosen to look like abandonment. She had found a weapon buried under the floor of the only place that belonged entirely to the people who built it, and she had used it, and the men who had spent years believing that the right amount of pressure applied to the right places would eventually get them what they wanted, had discovered in a conference room in Harrisburg that they were wrong. The mill was hers, the land was hers, the work was hers. Not because it had been given to her, she understood now that nothing real was ever simply given. It was hers because she had walked through the door and picked up the letter and read the name and driven to Alderton and stood in front of the man and asked the right question. It was hers because she had learned the machine and run the blade and cut the boards and stacked them at the east end of the floor. It was hers because she had finished the hawk. She stood with her hand on the steel until the last of the light faded and the mill went dark around her, filled with the particular darkness of a space that knows it will be lit again in the morning. Then she went to find something to eat and came back and kept working.